Good day. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you briefly about an aspect of Manitoba history. My presentation is entitled Manitoba's Ordinary Landscapes, an exploration of the familiar with a historical geographer. One of the things that I've always believed very strongly is that you can look at old scenes and old landscapes through different eyes, and you can learn a great deal of them. One of the things I learned when I first came to Canada over 50 years ago was that it was an advantage to me to be a foreigner, in that I looked at what was ordinary and very familiar to most Manitobans and most Canadians, but to me, it was all fresh and new and different. So I really felt advantaged in this regard. I could see things which maybe a native Manitoban would walk past without a second glance, but to me, it was different. And I was curious, and I wanted to understand how it came to be and what made it the way it was. So today, I'd like to look very briefly at some Manitoba landscapes which are perhaps very familiar to you, but perhaps I can get you to see them in a new way. So the first peoples who were to establish a cultural landscape in Manitoba were, of course, the original people, the indigenous people who occupied the land when the glaciers retreated tens of thousands of years ago. They trod very lightly on the land. They didn't leave much in the way of permanent buildings. Obviously, they built temporary shelters, the teepees, and so on. And they never survived the ravages of time. But you can see some evidence of their past occupation in parts of Manitoba, and especially further west on the open prairie. Teepee rings, rings of stones, which were used to hold down the sides of the teepees, fairly common. In Manitoba, we do have a few elements of indigenous occupation, which are still very evident. The way they hunted the bison in the era before the arrival of the horse, which in fact didn't get into Western Canada until about 1750 or so, was to herd them on the open prairie and cause them to stampede over a steep cliff or a very steep slope called a buffalo jump. And there's several in Manitoba. There's one just on the Trans-Canada Highway, the Grand Valley of the Assiniboine, a few miles west of Brandon. And there's another one near Cartwright in Manitoba, the so-called Claybanks Buffalo Jump. And you can see this on the picture ahead, which shows some MHS field trip participants looking at the jump, which is that just above the lady on the left-hand side, there's a small cliff, and that is part of the old Buffalo Jump. In the past, of course, the timber wasn't necessarily there, and it would have been pretty much open prairie. There are a number of them in Saskatchewan. The one is a provincial historic site, and of course, the one which you're probably familiar with is Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump National Historic Site near Fort Macleod in Alberta. But we do have them also in Manitoba. There's another site which is not so well known, perhaps, but is also a very interesting remnant of the indigenous peoples in the province. In the 1862, there was a rebellion by the Sioux down in Minnesota who were treated terribly by the Indian agent, and so he was actually murdered. And they then fled the area, fearing retribution. They were pursued up by Chippewa bounty hunters. They came over the line, international boundary line, and came into what became Manitoba. And they established rifle pits and defensive fortifications. So there are several of them in the province, but the one which is most accessible, and perhaps you can see most easily, is Flea Island. This was a series of trenches, rifle pits, and embankments which they established to protect themselves from threats of women and children and ward off any potential attack. It also gave some protection against the elements, and at the same time afforded a good defensive position. So one of these, in fact, Flea Island is now a provincial historic site, and you can actually check it out, its location, on the Manitoba website. After the Aboriginal peoples, another important group, of course, was the Métis, and they were instrumental in setting the fabric of settlement along the Red and the Assiniboine. And they brought with them a system of land subdivision, which emanated in Quebec and was copied by Miles MacDonnell when he surveyed the Red River settlement in the early 1800s. And this was a system of land subdivision which enabled every person to have a share of the resource base. So each lot ran back from the river, and it gave access to water. It also gave area where there would be some riparian vegetation or woodland, and then beyond that, on the higher ground, little higher ground, there was access to the prairie. And these lots ran back from the river for at least 2 miles, with a further 2 miles onto the prairie called the hay privilege. So these lots were copied from the kind of settlement system which prevailed in Quebec, but the lots were not exactly the same. They were 1/3 wider than those in Quebec. It was a great system for early settlement because the people relied very heavily on water, but it did mean that it was very difficult to go on the open prairie. And when the river lot's frontage was taken up, then latecomers were simply out of luck. This system of survey, which prevails pretty much from Selkirk right down to the US border, and also along the Assiniboine and along other small stretches of river like Lorette, town of Lorette, and St. Anne are also surveyed on the river lot system. It endures, and it's important because it shapes our communication pattern. If you look today at the pattern of streets in Winnipeg, which this next slide shows, you can see how the river lots run back at an angle from the Red River, but then when the river lots which were surveyed from the Assiniboine were surveyed, the two systems collide. And you can actually see this very, very clearly if you travel in the Grant Park area and take Cambridge Avenue. You'll notice that there are very few roads coming in from the west, but a lot of very short blocks coming in from the east. These eastern blocks, which are surveyed back from the Red, then intersect with the lots which run north and south in the Assiniboine. So this affects our street pattern. It affects the size of your lot, of your house, because the distance between any two streets, for example, between Waverley Street and Cambridge Street, is exactly the width of a river lot. And if you want to see it along, again, the Assiniboine, where the University of Winnipeg is located, is exactly on the site of a former river lot. So that's the width of the University of Winnipeg is the width of a river lot surveyed back from the Assiniboine. This is why Winnipeg, although people think it's surveyed on a rectangular grid, is not. And it's why when I first came to Winnipeg, I was constantly lost when I went around the end of Notre Dame and Portage Avenue. I was usually completely lost. There are exceptions. And one of the things we don't see when we look at our ordinary everyday landscape is the fact that when Winnipeg was first founded, it was founded on an area which was dissected by numerous creeks. You've all heard of Colony Creek, I'm sure, which was the reason why the Jury's Brewery was established very close to Assiniboine for the water supply. You know about Omans Creek. There are a number of other creeks. Most of them have been built over and are not discernible on the landscape. But if you go into St. Boniface and check out Enfield Crescent, you'll actually be driving down an old bed of the Red River, which periodically, when it loops around in meanders, these loops are cut off and they're called oxbows. At Portage de Prairie, there's a huge oxbow just south of town, which is a remnant of the old Assiniboine. In Enfield Crescent, and I don't know if you can see that, but it would be this area I'm pointing out on my pointer now. is on there's a crescent that runs right down there. And if you go to Ellenfield Crescent, you will see that there is a bank. And this is one of the few places where real estate agents will actually advertise that the house is on the hill. Not much of a hill, I admit, but for Winnipeg, it's a pretty good one. This is the cut bank of the Red River many hundreds of years ago. It wasn't built on because it was swampy, and the first houses were not put in this area until about 1900. If you go to the other direction, you'll see that there is a more gentle slope called the slip-off slope, which has a very gentle slope. And again, it's very much typical of the meander loop you'll find on the Red River. A further landscape, which is bound up, as with the Métis, with the fur trade, is that of the mixed bloods, Scots and native peoples who were very important in the fur trade era. Many of them were Orkney men. They were recruited by the Hudson's Bay Company because they're experienced with harsh northern conditions, and also they were desperate for employment. When they came, they built the tradition of building in stone. And this was not done very much. There was not a lot of stone around readily available. But at the rapids of the Red River, close to Selkirk, where Fort Garry is now located, they were able to quarry stone. And you can actually still see the old quarry site if you drive along River Road just before you get to St. Andrews as what looks like a bit of a meander loop, but that's the site of the former stone quarry. And they're built in the fashion of the day. This is not typical Orkney architecture, but it's typical Orkney building material. Further example, not very far away from the Kennedy House, which was built in the 1860s, by the way, was the Hay House, which is very unusual. It's a mixture of stone construction and timber. So you got the melding of the Orkney tradition and the Manitoba tradition of building in log. It's designated as a protected building, but it's very hard to see in the summertime because it's pretty well screened from the road by a lot of trees. The other group, which also put a very strong stamp on the landscape, was, of course, the French and the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was intimately involved with the Métis community, and they were here very early in Manitoba. And they left a very distinctive landscape, one which was essentially imported from Quebec. So Roman Catholic churches along the Red River Valley in the French and Métis communities like Saint Jean Baptiste and Saint Malo, Saint Pierre Joly used to have a church like this. A very strong tradition of the twin towers and the basilica-like circular window in the frontal area. This slide shows the St. Norbert Roman Catholic Parish Church in St. Norbert, which was a fairly recent, 1935, I believe it was built, but the former church, which looked pretty similar, it was a replacement when the former church was burned down. Across the road is a really interesting historic site and something we don't see very many of in Manitoba anymore, but are quite common in Quebec. And that is there's a chapel, the St. Norbert Chapel, I excuse my French, but La Chapelle de Notre-Dame du Bon Secours. It was built in 1870, one of the few open-air chapels in Manitoba. It's a provincial historic site. I won't say it's unique, but it's certainly rare in Manitoba. Further south down the Red River, at St. Malo, there is I would say, unique grotto built on the banks of the Rat River, not very far away from St. Malo Park. You have to go off the highway a little bit. It's not too hard to find. And there's an old church and a grotto. And this is the site of some massive pilgrimages held by the Roman Catholic Church. Again, well worth a visit, but it does typify the Roman Catholic stamp upon the landscape right the way down. The towns and the buildings that were in these French-Canadian towns very often incorporated the fashion of the day in Quebec. There was a architectural style called the Second Empire Revival, became very popular in France during the so-called Second Empire of Napoleon III. And this style was exported from France and came to Quebec and also to other parts of Canada, but especially in Quebec, and was brought by the Catholic Church into Manitoba. This is in St. Boniface, I believe it's the Archbishop's residence, and shows the so-called Second Empire style, which is typified by its mansard roof and dormers. But you'll find this was adopted not only in Winnipeg on St. Boniface, but also in the rural towns south of Winnipeg. St. Malo, for example, has some good examples, and there's also one in St. Pierre-Joly, which is not really that old. It's a modern facade put on a very ordinary building, but its objective clearly is to impart some kind of French character to the landscape. So it's kind of an ethnic symbol, if you like, in Manitoba's landscape. But as you drive south, you can clearly see the remnants of this French tradition of wide boulevards, and of course the Twin Tower Church, very often the Roman Catholic convent is in there, and also the wide boulevard, which was very fashionable at the time of the foundation of these settlements. Most of Manitoba, however, was surveyed after 1870 using the Sectional Survey, where the land was divided into townships of 36 square miles. And this was a system which was copied from the Americans with some modifications. It was done for ease of administration more than anything else. The primary concern was administering the system rather than the needs of the settlers. In the early years, it wasn't that great a settlement system because it meant that the settler would maybe denied access to water. Until they had the water pump, the windmill water pump was developed. It really wasn't a very practical system, but it was administratively simple. And it did set the fabric of Western Canada. And when you fly over it, you can very clearly see the stamp of the administrator is firmly entrenched upon the landscape. There were exceptions, however. When the Mennonites came in, they were allocated two reserves. The East Reserve, where Steinbach is located, and later on, 1 year later, the West Reserve. When the Mennonites came in, they received a lot of privileges from the government, the ability to have land set aside for exclusive settlement, the ability to settle in villages. But the government gave them land they thought was good land because it had water and meadow and timber. But the Mennonites were used to settling on the steppe lands of Ukraine, and they didn't need to have access to timber in the same way as most other settlers. And they also had a communal system of agricultural development, which meant that they didn't need to have a lot of wood for fencing. They farmed communally. So they eyed with some degree of enthusiasm the prospect of going further west onto the prairie, which few other settlers wanted to do. So in 1875, the federal government allocated them another reserve, the West Reserve, of 17 townships. This is, almost 500,000 acres of land for their exclusive settlement. And they established on that land their system of village farming, cooperative farming, where they settled in villages. And unlike most areas of Western Canada, these villages were not established by the railroads. They were independent, which makes it unusual. But what made it really unusual was that they transferred not only their village system of farming from Europe, but also their architectural styles. This slide shows an aerial view from Google Earth of the village of Rhineland, Manitoba. Rhineland, from the spelling, means clear land, good land. It has nothing to do with the River Rhine. And you can see it was houses were laid out along a street village called technically a Straßendorf. And the idea was that everyone had an equal share of the land. And the land was farmed in an old medieval system of communal farming. This didn't last long because the federal government required that everyone had title to a specific quarter section. They wouldn't grant title to the community. they had to split the village up eventually, and each person tended to move out to their own quarter. What they did do also is they brought with them their architectural styles, which emanated from the Friesland area of the Netherlands. And even today, if you were to go to Europe, you can see the house barn combinations in Friesland, and on the northwest polder of the northeast polder of the IJsselmeer, you can see the house and the adjoining corridor and a barn. This is a variation, I'll show you another picture of one, a modern building built in the 1950s and early 1960s of a house barn combination. The Mennonites who came from this area built the houses like this because the area was low-lying and prone to flooding. So when it flooded, they didn't want to have to row over to their barn or to their cattle pen or what have you. They put everything together, and they built these farms on berms raised above the floodwaters. When they moved to Prussia, fleeing for religious freedom, they simply built in the old-fashioned way, because it was, again, well adapted to the low-lying lands of the Vistula Delta. When they were then in the 1750s moved to Ukraine, enticed by Catherine the Great, they took their farming system with them, and they took their architectural styles. And again, it was easily adapted to the steppe lands, because it made a lot of sense in the cold winters to have your stock and your domestic building close together. When they moved to Canada from Ukraine, they brought that style with them. And it's ironic, but you can see examples of actually medieval style architecture of Europe are firmly entrenched in the landscapes of the West Reserve. And many of these houses still exist, especially in the village of New Bergtal, which is in the south part of the province, which is now a National Historic Site. And this is a good example of a so-called Mennonite house barn. And again, it's a system of building based upon tradition that came all the way from Friesland through Poland or Prussia, I should say, into Ukraine, to Manitoba. And then in the 1920s, when they moved south, seeking greater religious freedom, they took it with them to Paraguay and to Mexico, where you still can see this kind of architecture. Another building here shows very modern building, but still retains elements of the old style, the house and the barn together. And the next slide shows that people still are trying to keep the tradition alive by building modern houses in traditional style. And I've seen this in a few Mennonite chapels. They have this break in the roof line, which is symbolic of the house barn, that's been incorporated into their places of worship, which otherwise still remain very, very plain. The other group I wanted to mention very briefly is that the Ukrainians, who came in comparatively late into Manitoba, first settled in Manitoba in 1896. And they brought with them, not in a physical sense, but they brought in a conceptual sense, they built their houses as they had in the old country. And this next slide and the one after it show the kind of architecture which was traditional in Western Ukraine. This is a village called Onut in the province of Bukovina in Ukraine. You'll notice a very distinctive whitewashed building with a heavy overhanging so-called cottage roof. Just over the border in Romania, Soret, I took this picture of this traditional style house, still lived in, still used in everyday fashion. And I thought, wow, this is really, really similar to the building which you'll find at Leonard near to the Romanian Orthodox Church. And this is almost a carbon copy. It wasn't done deliberately. When people came over, they simply built in the way they used to build back in the old country. It was a log house, plastered on the exterior, a very heavy roof with a very distinctive eyebrow vents, which are relic elements incorporated in the house for ventilation, but that used to be back 150, 160 years ago, would be where the smoke simply filtered out of the roof. There was no chimney. Religion, of course, is also a vital element in the landscape. If you want to see some spectacular architecture, you can do no better than to take a short trip up to Cook's Creek, where there's this magnificent prairie cathedral designed by Father Philip Roux, who in fact was Alsatian. He was not Ukrainian, but he was a member of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. He was born in Alsace, as I said before. And he spent a year studying in Ukraine, and he was very much entranced by the architecture. And so he built this prairie cathedral and many others like it. The one at Dauphin he also built, which is also like the one at Cook's Creek, a provincial historic site. He built them as a copy of St. Sophia's in Ukraine, built by hand. There was no mechanization used at all, and it was finished off in the 1930s. And he also built, right adjacent, a 2/3 scale copy of the grotto at Lourdes. So a piece of magnificent prairie architecture, which is, again, really worth the visit. But while you're looking at churches, I would encourage you to take a look, just wander around the cemeteries there, and you'll see and learn a great deal about pioneer life. This is a cemetery near Cook's Creek, established by the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and it has the Nazarevich tombstone, which lists the names and birth and death dates of all the children. And you'll see that 5 or 6 of them never made it past the age of 5 years old. Many died within a year. But those that did make it past 5, some of them lived until their 90s. So it tells you a great deal about the rigors of life, and you can also learn a great deal about the way in which the Ukrainian culture gradually was assimilated or changed by the incorporation of the Latin alphabet and the style of the tombstone. And very often will tell you where these people came from and when they came, a little bit about them. And the architecture too, in these Ukrainian settlements at Cook's Creek or further down south in the Gardenton area, really very interesting architecture. Looks to me as though it was lifted out of Western Ukraine, as it really was, and plunked into the area of southern Manitoba. You'll find these churches very distinctive. The bell tower, as you can see here, is always separate from the church. It's never incorporated within the church. And the Byzantine dome, a very distinctive kind of design, and the tripart design of the church, all carries religious meaning and adds a very distinctive element to the Manitoba landscape. Finally, if you take a drive into southeast Manitoba, be sure to go down to Circle and take a look at the church at Circle, built in 1909 in the old style. This is before the Byzantine dome became that popular in Western Ukraine. This is a typical church you'll find in the villages in Galicia and Bukovina, with a authentic separate bell tower. And behind it, if you see in the next picture, is a more modern version of the church, which was built in 1950. So 2 churches, both called St. Elias. There's also at Leonard, there's an almost identical church built by settlers who came from the border region of Romania and spoke Romanian, but they basically carried the same architectural tradition with them. And this is the one at St. Elias at Circle and the one at Leonard are almost identical. In the background is the church that was built in the 1950s, because the present church was in the foreground was considered to be too small. So that was a very brief review of some elements of the Manitoba landscape, and I would encourage you to take a look at any of these, because all of the sites which you've shown in this presentation are within an hour's drive from Winnipeg. That is, all the slides I took in Manitoba are within an hour's or 2 driving from Winnipeg. If you've not seen them before, take a drive and take a look. Maybe even if you don't want to do that, you can take a look at Enfield Crescent and look at some of the old sites in Winnipeg, which still retain a very strong ethnic impress. So that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll say good day. Bye-bye.